I never thought I would sit here, after so many decades, and finally open the door to a chapter of my life that I swore would stay buried. But age has a way of loosening the chains of silence. Perhaps when you grow older, you realize that secrets do not just protect you, they also imprison you. I am no longer the frightened girl who entered a convent at 17. I am an old woman now, a servant of Christ for most of my life, and yet there are nights when memories come like shadows under the door, reminding me of wounds that never completely healed. Tonight, I want to tell you about the road that led me here, not the saintly, holy path people imagine when they hear the word nun, but a path paved with coercion, betrayal, and eventually an unexpected truth that changed everything. My name does not matter as much as the testimony I carry, but for the sake of honesty, you may call me Sister Maria. I was born into a family that looked respectable from the outside. Neighbors saw us dressed in our best for Sunday Mass, heard my father's deep voice leading prayers at the table, and watched my mother sit in the front pew with her rosary wrapped around her fingers. What no one saw were the fractures beneath the polished image. Poverty pressed against us like a heavy weight. My father, though proud, struggled to keep steady work. My mother, exhausted from raising many children, often looked at me not with tenderness, but with calculation, as if I were a burden she longed to set down. When I was a little girl, I believed I would one day marry, raise children, and live a life of my choosing. That dream died slowly, replaced by the constant reminder that my family had no dowry to offer, no means to lift me into a respectable marriage. In our town, young women without prospects often became brides of Christ. It was spoken of as an honor, as though being cloistered away was the highest gift a girl could give her family. But I knew, even as a child, that my family's desire had little to do with my soul and everything to do with convenience. One less mouth to feed, one less daughter to worry about. By the time I turned 17, the decision was made for me. I remember that morning as if it happened yesterday. My mother laid out a plain dress on my bed, not the white of a bride, but the gray of surrender. "This is the Lord's will," she told me, smoothing the fabric with her hands. But her eyes avoided mine. She could not look directly at me, perhaps because deep down she knew the truth. It was not the Lord's will, it was hers. My father kissed my forehead and said I would make the family proud. His words felt heavy, final, as though he were laying a stone on my chest. The journey to the convent was silent. I sat in the back of a rattling carriage, clutching a small bag with everything I owned. The countryside rolled past the window in muted colors of spring, but I barely saw it. My heart thudded against my ribs, each mile pulling me farther from the life I had imagined and closer to the unknown. I wanted to cry, to scream, to beg them to turn around. But even at 17, I understood the futility. In my family, obedience was survival. To protest was to invite shame, and shame was a wound far deeper than hunger. When the gates of the convent came into view, my throat tightened. The iron bars looked less like an entrance and more like the teeth of a cage. A tall stone building rose behind them, its windows narrow and dark, as though it were watching me even before I crossed the threshold. I remember the sound of the hinges as the gates opened, a groaning sound that still echoes in my mind. That was the moment I knew my life would never again belong fully to me. Inside, the air smelled of incense and damp stone. The corridors stretched long and cold, lined with statues of saints whose marble faces carried no comfort. A group of nuns in black habits moved silently past us, their eyes lowered. They seemed less like women and more like shadows gliding across the floor. My mother pressed a trembling kiss to my cheek, whispered, "Be good, child," and turned away. My father gave a stiff nod, and then they were gone. Just like that. 17 years of girlhood ended at the closing of a door. Mother Superior greeted me with a voice as sharp as the click of her rosary beads. She welcomed me not with warmth, but with rules. "You are here to serve," she said. Obedience is the foundation of holiness. Forget the world beyond these walls, for it no longer belongs to you. I lowered my head, biting my lip to keep from crying. Somewhere inside, a part of me wanted to believe her words were sacred, that surrender would bring peace. But another part whispered a different truth. This was not God's choice. It was mine, stolen from me. That first night, I lay in a narrow bed beneath a thin blanket, listening to the distant toll of the chapel bell. The dormitory smelled of candle wax and cold stone. Around me, other girls shifted and whispered prayers, but I could not join them. My lips would not form the words. I pressed my face into the pillow and let silent tears soak the cloth. I begged God to hear me, though I was not sure he was listening. The convent was supposed to be his house, but to me it felt like exile. I want you to understand something. At 17, I was not rebellious. I was not ungrateful. I wanted to believe in holiness, in sacrifice, in something larger than myself. But what I felt as I drifted into restless sleep was not the peace of devotion. It was the heavy dread of a prisoner learning her sentence. That was the beginning of my life in the convent, the place that would strip away my innocence, test the limits of my faith, and eventually reveal truths I never imagined. Looking back now, I see that everything that followed, the pain, the silence, the eventual discovery, was born in that moment when the gates closed behind me. And though I did not yet know it, my story was only beginning. Before I was forced into the convent, I was simply a girl with ordinary dreams, though even in childhood, I often felt those dreams were never truly mine to hold. I was born the fourth child in a family that already staggered under the weight of too many mouths and too few coins. My 3 older brothers were always given priority, better food, warmer clothes, more lenience when they stumbled. I was expected to be the quiet one, the helpful one, the daughter who obeyed without question. Our town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew the color of their neighbors' curtains and how often they attended Mass. Reputation was everything, and my family clung desperately to the image of piety. We lived in a modest house where crucifixes hung on every wall and the Virgin's portrait looked down from the mantel. Visitors might have thought it was a home overflowing with faith, but to me, it often felt like a stage. My father's prayers grew louder when others were listening. My mother's smile tightened whenever gossip drifted near. Behind closed doors, their faith looked less like love of God and more like fear of shame. I was a quiet child, eager to please. My earliest memories are of sweeping the kitchen floor with a broom almost taller than myself, or standing on a stool to stir thin soup while my mother mended clothes by the light of a fading candle. Sometimes, if I did everything just right, she would pat my hand and say, "Good girl." Those 2 words were all the reward I longed for. Approval was rare enough that it felt like gold. School was both a blessing and a burden. I loved reading, loved the way words opened windows to worlds beyond the narrow streets of our village. But even in the classroom, expectations pressed heavily upon me. Teachers praised diligence but warned against pride. A girl must be humble, they would say. When I dreamed aloud of becoming a teacher or perhaps a nurse one day, my mother's face grew hard. "Do not fill your head with nonsense," she scolded. "Your future is already written. You belong to the church." I began to notice the whispers when I was barely 13. Older women in the parish would glance at me, nod knowingly, and remark that I had a holy face or the look of a bride of Christ. At the time, I did not understand these comments were not blessings, but foreshadowing. Each remark was another thread weaving the net that would one day close around me. My father often spoke of sacrifices. "Every family must give something back to God," he would say. For some, it was money placed faithfully in the collection basket. For others, it was service. For us, poor as we were, the only offering of value was a daughter's life given to the convent. He said it proudly, as though offering me up would purchase salvation for us all. Yet, when he looked at me, I sometimes wondered if he saw his daughter or simply currency for heaven. By 16, the path ahead was already narrowing. Suitors did not come to our door. My brothers mocked the idea of me marrying, sneering that no man would want a girl with no dowry. My mother, perhaps to comfort herself, told neighbors that I was destined for holy service. She said it with such confidence that people began to believe it, and in time, so did I. Not because I felt called, but because I saw no escape. There were moments, though, when my true self broke through. I remember one summer evening when I slipped out to the meadow behind our house. The air was thick with fireflies, the sky brushed with violet. For a brief moment, standing barefoot in the grass, I imagined another life, one where I chose my own path, where laughter and love belonged to me. But then the church bells rang and reality pulled me back. I hurried home before my mother noticed my absence. That fleeting taste of freedom haunted me because deep down I knew it was something I might never have again. When the decision was finally spoken aloud, it came not as a discussion but as a decree. My parents called me into the parlor, the crucifix casting its shadow across the wall. "Maria," my father said, "the convent has agreed to receive you. This is a great honor." His voice carried pride, but also finality. My mother folded her hands tightly, her eyes gleaming with a strange mixture of relief and triumph. They did not ask if I wished it. They did not ask what I dreamed of. To them, my silence was consent. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, while my heart screamed inside my chest. 17 years of life, and not once had I been asked what I wanted. In that moment, I realized that my voice had never truly been mine. It had always belonged to others, parents, priests, neighbors, everyone except me. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind rattle the shutters. My brothers snored in the next room, my parents murmured prayers beyond the wall, and I stared at the ceiling, wondering if God himself heard me. I whispered into the darkness, "Do you really want this? Or is this only them speaking in your name?" No answer came, only silence. As the day of departure drew near, preparations were made. My mother sewed me plain undergarments, folded them carefully into a bag, and placed a small silver crucifix on top. "This will keep you safe," she said, though her eyes betrayed unease. My father walked taller in those days, boasting to neighbors about his daughter's holy vocation. I kept my head down, practicing obedience even as despair hollowed me out. On the morning of my departure, the sun rose bright, but for me the world looked gray. I dressed slowly, as though each movement was a step away from myself. My mother braided my hair one last time, her fingers surprisingly gentle. When she finished, she whispered, "Do not shame us." It was not a blessing. It was a command. The carriage arrived at dawn. I climbed inside, clutching the small bag to my chest, and watched as my parents grew smaller with each turn of the wheel. My brothers did not come to say goodbye. Perhaps they felt no need. In their eyes, my fate had already been sealed. I remember pressing my forehead to the window glass, the cold seeping into my skin. Fields and villages blurred past, but I hardly saw them. All I could think was that I was leaving behind the girl I had been, stepping into a life chosen by others. And though I tried to tell myself it was God's plan, the hollow ache in my chest told another story. That was how I came to the gates of the convent, forced by circumstance, bound by obedience, and carrying within me the fragile hope that perhaps someday God would show me a truth greater than the one my parents had forced upon me. The first days within the convent felt like stepping into another world, one that operated by laws both strict and unyielding. If the town where I was raised had been small, the convent seemed smaller still, not in size, for its corridors stretched endlessly, but in how tightly it wrapped around your freedom. The walls themselves seemed alive, whispering that there was no escape. I remember the clang of the great iron gates as they shut behind me that first evening. The sound reverberated through my bones, a sound not of welcome but of imprisonment. The stone paths were wet from an earlier rain, and my shoes, still polished from my mother's hand, quickly dulled with mud. I followed the Mother Superior inside, my small bag clutched in both hands, the crucifix my father had given me hanging heavily against my chest. The convent was dimly lit, its hallways lined with flickering candles. Every corner smelled of wax, incense, and something faintly damp, as though centuries of prayers had seeped into the stone and refused to leave. The silence was suffocating. Girls moved quickly, eyes lowered, their steps careful on the cold flagstones. No one spoke unless commanded. To a stranger it might have seemed like discipline. To me, it felt like erasure. That first night we were summoned to the refectory for a simple meal. Long wooden tables stretched the length of the hall, and bowls of thin soup were placed before us. We were told not to speak, only to eat. The scraping of spoons against bowls filled the silence. Across from me sat other young women, some perhaps not much older than myself, others already hardened into the faces of lifelong sisters. They did not smile. Their eyes were lowered as if afraid to meet mine, as though friendliness itself were forbidden. I wanted to ask them if they too had been sent here against their will, but the rules kept my mouth shut. After supper, we were led to the chapel. The tall windows were stained glass, but at night the colors were invisible, swallowed by darkness. A statue of the Virgin stood at the altar, her eyes lowered, her face carved in sorrow. We knelt on the wooden pews while the Mother Superior recited prayers in a voice that cut the silence like a blade. Her words were smooth, but there was no warmth in them. She spoke of sacrifice, of obedience, of dying to oneself so that God's will might live. I tried to pray, but my heart felt heavy. I did not feel God's presence, only the weight of stone pressing down on me. The dormitory where I was assigned held 10 beds lined in a row. Each bed was narrow, covered with a thin blanket that smelled faintly of soap and cold air. I was given no choice where to sleep. A senior nun pointed, and I obeyed. That night, I listened to the soft breaths of the other girls and wondered if any of them cried silently into their pillows as I did. My tears fell quietly, soaking into the fabric as I begged heaven for comfort. None came. The days fell into a rhythm that was less life than ritual. We rose before dawn to the tolling of the bell, dressed in plain habits, and filed into the chapel for morning prayers. Then came work, scrubbing floors, tending gardens, mending garments for the priests. Each hour was marked by the bell, and each task was performed in silence. Even laughter seemed sinful here. When I dared to hum softly while hanging laundry, a stern voice snapped behind me. "Silence, child. Your voice is not your own." I swallowed the song and felt it die in my throat. It was during these long days that I first began to notice the gaze of authority pressing closer. At first, it was subtle, the Mother Superior's eyes lingering on me longer than on others, a priest's questions about my obedience framed as casual but too persistent. There was a way they looked at me, not as a soul to guide, but as something to mold, to control. It unsettled me deeply. I told myself it was only my imagination, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing day. Once, while cleaning the library, I found myself alone as evening shadows crept across the shelves. I reached for a book of prayers, my fingers brushing against its worn leather cover, when I felt someone step behind me. The air shifted. I turned, and a senior nun stood too close, her smile faint but cold. She spoke softly, almost kindly, yet her words carried weight. "You are here to learn obedience, Sister Maria. God sees everything you do. If you resist Him." Her hand lingered on my shoulder just a moment too long. I froze, unable to breathe. When she finally walked away, my knees trembled. That night I could not sleep. I replayed her tone, her touch, her warning. For the first time, I wondered if my fear was not only of the convent itself, but of what might lurk within it. The convent's silence became its own form of torture. Silence during meals, silence during chores, silence in the dormitory after prayers. Yet within that silence, small cruelties thrived. A harsh word disguised as correction, an extra punishment for a mistake. Rumors whispered just loud enough for me to hear. Each act chipped away at my spirit. I began to dress more plainly than even the rules required, trying to disappear. I cut my laughter, my questions, even my voice. If invisibility could be my shield, I thought perhaps I could survive. But invisibility is never complete. The more I tried to vanish, the more I seemed to draw the gaze of those who demanded control. I could feel it, the way footsteps paused behind me, the way whispers ceased when I entered a room. The convent, meant to be a house of God, felt instead like a place where shadows moved unseen, watching, waiting. At 17, I thought I had already lost my freedom when I was sent through those gates. I did not yet realize that worse than losing freedom is losing the sense that you are safe in your own skin. And though I tried to pray, tried to cling to faith, my heart trembled with the certainty that something darker lay ahead. That was the moment when the silent walls stopped being merely stone. They became witnesses, keepers of secrets I had not yet discovered, and within their shadows, my true ordeal was only beginning. I had entered the convent expecting hardship. I had been warned about long prayers, strict rules, and endless labor. What I had not expected was the loneliness that grew heavier by the day, or the way that loneliness could make even the sound of footsteps behind me feel like a threat. At first, I told myself it was only nerves. After all, I was young, only 17, far from home, and living under rules that seemed designed to erase individuality. But deep inside, I sensed something more. There was a weight in the air, a silence that did not come from holiness, but from fear. And soon enough, that silence broke. It happened one evening after Vespers. The chapel was dim, lit only by candles that flickered against the carved faces of the saints. The other novices filed out quietly, their black habits rustling as they slipped through the heavy wooden doors. I lingered a moment too long, kneeling before the Virgin's statue. I whispered a prayer, asking for strength, asking for clarity, asking simply to endure another day. When I rose to leave, I found that I was not alone. A senior nun stood near the back pew, her face half in shadow. She had always watched me more closely than the others, though I had tried to ignore it. That night her gaze did not waver. "Maria," she said softly, "come here." My feet obeyed even as my heart resisted. I approached slowly, each step echoing against the stone floor. When I reached her, she smiled faintly, though it was not the kind of smile that offered comfort. It was the kind of smile that warned you that resistance was useless. "You have been chosen for a special path," she said, her voice low but firm. "Not every girl is blessed with the strength to carry such a burden, but I see it in you." Her words confused me. Chosen? Blessed? I wanted to believe she meant something holy, something sacred. But the way her hand reached out and rested on my arm told me otherwise. The grip was not cruel, not yet, but it was too firm to be gentle. In that moment, everything inside me screamed to pull away, to run, to cry out. But the convent had already taught me obedience, silence, stillness. My voice caught in my throat. I stood frozen as her hand lingered. "You must learn," she whispered, "that obedience is not only in prayer and labor, it is in giving yourself fully. Do you understand?" I shook my head quickly, desperate to escape, but she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "God is watching. If you resist him. Do you want to bring shame upon your family? Do you want to fall from grace?" The words pierced me more sharply than her grip. Shame was the language of my childhood. My parents had wielded it like a weapon, reminding me always that reputation mattered more than happiness. Now, here, in this sacred place, the same weapon was used again. I felt the walls of my will crumble. When she finally released me, I hurried back to the dormitory, my hands trembling so violently I had to hide them beneath my blanket. That night, I could not sleep. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every rustle of fabric made me flinch. The dormitory was filled with girls breathing quietly in their dreams, but I felt utterly alone, as if I were already marked. The following days did not bring relief. If anything, the watchful eyes grew more persistent. Chores were no longer simple tasks, but stages for judgment. When I scrubbed the chapel floor, I felt her presence behind me. When I carried laundry to the line, I sensed her gaze from the window above. There was no corner of the convent where I could hide, no silence deep enough to shield me. I began to change without realizing it. My steps grew smaller, my eyes stayed fixed on the ground. I avoided speaking unless directly addressed. The laughter that had once escaped me even in sorrow was gone. Other girls noticed, though they said little. Some avoided me entirely, as if fear itself were contagious. One afternoon, while polishing the brass candlesticks in the sacristy, another novice whispered, "Be careful." She glanced nervously over her shoulder before hurrying away. Her warning stayed with me. It confirmed what I already knew, but did not want to admit, that I was not imagining the danger. The others felt it too. The breaking of innocence does not come all at once. It comes in moments, each one carving away a piece of trust until nothing remains. A hand too heavy on the shoulder, a word twisted into threat, a silence that forces complicity. By the time I realized how deeply trapped I was, my innocence was already gone. I stopped writing letters home. What could I say? That the convent, which my parents believed to be holy ground, had become a place of dread? They would not believe me. Worse, they would accuse me of sin, of dishonoring the family with lies. So I remained silent. My voice belonged to others now, not to me. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. I prayed, but my prayers felt hollow. The God I had known as a child, the God who comforted me in the meadow under firefly skies, seemed impossibly far away. I began to wonder if he had abandoned me, or if he was never there to begin with. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling beams above my narrow bed, I whispered into the darkness, "If you are real, show me. If you are good, protect me." The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like mockery. Tears burned my eyes, but I did not let them fall. Even my tears felt stolen. That was how my innocence ended, not with a single act, but with the slow realization that the place I had been told would bring me closer to God was instead stripping me of myself. I was no longer Maria the daughter, Maria the girl, Maria with dreams. I was Maria the obedient, Maria the silent, Maria the broken. And though I could not yet see the full storm ahead, I knew the shadows had only just begun to gather. The days that followed pressed against me like a weight I could not shake. The convent, once only a place of rules and cold stone, became a prison of whispers and unspoken threats. I learned quickly that silence was not only expected, it was demanded, enforced, and used as a weapon. Everywhere I turned, there was a reminder that my voice did not belong to me. At meals, we were forbidden to speak, except for brief prayers. At chores, the sound of brooms on stone or hands wringing laundry filled the air while our mouths stayed shut. Even in the dormitory, where young girls should have whispered secrets and shared small laughter, there was only the heavy stillness of fear. I began to realize that silence was not merely discipline, it was control. Without words, you cannot warn, cannot protest, cannot even ask if the fear in your heart is shared by another. Silence kept us isolated, each girl trapped inside her own private suffering. The senior nun who had cornered me in the chapel seemed to sense this power. Her words lingered in my mind. Obedience is giving yourself fully. She never needed to repeat them aloud, because they echoed every time her shadow crossed my path. If I faltered in my work, her eyes would fix on me until shame burned in my chest. If I dared look at another novice too long, she would separate us with a simple gesture, as if reminding me that even friendship was forbidden. One afternoon, I was assigned to mend habits in a small sewing room. The sun slanted through narrow windows, dust motes floating like tiny sparks in the light. I worked quietly, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of a needle and thread. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. She entered without a word, closing the door softly behind her. My hands trembled, the needle slipping and pricking my finger. A drop of blood stained the fabric. She took the garment from my lap, inspected it, and spoke in a voice smooth as oil. "Careless. Do you think God is pleased with sloppy work?" I shook my head quickly, whispering, "No, sister." Her lips curved into a thin smile. "Then remember, perfection is obedience, and obedience is holiness." She placed the cloth back on my lap and rested her hand on mine just long enough to remind me that resistance would be punished. Then she left, her steps fading down the hall. I sat frozen, the small red stain on the fabric spreading like a wound I could not hide. That evening I did not eat. My stomach churned, and the soup before me turned cold. I stared at the crucifix above the refectory doors and wondered why the Christ who had suffered was silent still, even now, when his child begged for deliverance. The threats were rarely spoken directly. They did not need to be. A punishment for a mistake lasted long in memory. Kneeling for hours on the cold chapel floor until your knees burned. Being denied food for a day, forced to watch others eat while hunger gnawed at your belly. Scrubbing the same stones until your hands bled. Each punishment was justified as correction, as holy discipline, but we all knew better. They were warnings. Speak out, resist, and you will suffer more. And then there were the words whispered in the dark. One night, as I walked back from evening prayers, the senior nun stopped me in the corridor. The torchlight flickered, throwing her face into shadow. "Remember, child," she said, her voice low, "God punishes liars. If you ever speak of things not meant to be spoken, he will turn his face from you." My heart pounded. She did not have to say what those things were. I understood. The chains of silence tightened around me. I began to doubt my own thoughts. Perhaps it was my fault. Perhaps I misunderstood. Perhaps the fear was punishment for some hidden sin. Each day I carried these questions like stones in my chest. At times I thought of my family. Would they believe me if I wrote home? Would they come to take me back? But then I remembered my mother's warning. Do not shame us. I knew what her answer would be. She would tell me to endure, to obey, to keep silent for the honor of our family. And my father, who had spoken so proudly of his sacrifice, would never admit that his gift to God was suffering instead of holiness. So I kept quiet. I wore my silence like armor, even as it corroded me from within. My health began to falter. I grew thin, my skin pale, my eyes shadowed. Sleep came fitfully, broken by nightmares where voices whispered in the dark, accusing, threatening, demanding my obedience. I prayed less and less, for prayer only brought me back to the same unanswered silence. One day, as I scrubbed the stone floor of the chapel, I fainted. My body crumpled forward, the bucket tipping and spilling water across the steps of the altar. When I awoke, I was lying on a wooden cot in the infirmary. A kind-faced novice pressed a cloth to my forehead, whispering that I had collapsed from exhaustion. She told me to rest, but even in her kindness, I saw fear in her eyes, fear that helping me might draw unwanted attention. That was when I understood the full power of silence. It was not just mine. It belonged to everyone. Each girl lived in fear of speaking, in fear of being punished, in fear of losing even the smallest scrap of protection. And because of that fear, the truth remained hidden, locked away within walls that had heard countless prayers, but also countless cries, never spoken aloud. The chains of silence were not visible. They left no marks on the skin. But they bound tighter than any rope, locking me into a life I had not chosen, into a suffering I could not name. And as I lay awake at night, staring at the beams above my bed, I wondered if I would ever find the strength to break free, or if silence would be the story of my life forever. The morning bells tolled as they always did, loud and insistent, demanding that we rise from our narrow beds and shuffle to prayer. I tried to lift my body, but it felt as though iron weights were strapped to my limbs. My hands trembled, my breath came shallow, and a cold sweat dampened my brow. Still, I forced myself up, because in the convent there was no room for weakness. To show fatigue was to invite scorn. As we knelt in the chapel, I bowed my head, but the words of the Psalms blurred together. My lips moved without meaning. The Latin verses had become empty sounds to me, hollow echoes bouncing off stone walls. I used to believe each prayer rose like incense to heaven, but now they seemed to vanish into the stale air, leaving nothing but silence in return. That silence frightened me more than the punishments. It was a silence that felt eternal, as though even God himself had turned away. I wondered, had he abandoned me because I was not obedient enough? Or worse, because I had dared to question even in the privacy of my heart? The senior nun seemed to sense my weakness. She watched me more closely now, her eyes sharp, as though she could read the doubt etched into my soul. One evening, after chores, she called me aside. Her voice was calm, but her words cut deep. "Child, you must learn that resistance brings only suffering. The sooner you surrender fully, the sooner you will find peace." I nodded, but inside, a storm raged. Surrender no longer felt holy. It felt like death. My health worsened. The fainting spells grew frequent. Once I collapsed in the laundry room, my body folding over the washtub. Another time, I nearly fell down the stone steps carrying buckets of water. The sisters muttered that I was weak, that I lacked discipline. But I knew it was not weakness. It was the weight of despair slowly crushing me. Nights became unbearable. I lay awake listening to the sighs and restless turns of other girls in the dormitory. Though none of us spoke, I could feel their unease, their hidden tears. Sometimes I caught glimpses, eyes red from weeping, hands clenched tightly in prayer, as if to squeeze answers from a silent heaven. Their suffering mirrored mine, yet we were all bound in the same vow of fear. One night, unable to bear the silence, I slipped quietly from bed and walked barefoot into the chapel. The moonlight filtered through stained glass, painting the stone floor in fractured colors. I knelt before the crucifix, my body shaking. "Lord," I whispered, "if you hear me, show me something, anything. I cannot go on like this." My voice cracked, echoing faintly before fading. There was no reply, only the creak of the rafters and the distant hoot of an owl outside. It was then that doubt pierced me fully. For the first time, I wondered if God truly listened, or if the silence I felt was all there would ever be. This thought terrified me. Without faith, what reason was there for this suffering? Without God's love, what hope was left? The days blurred. Work, prayer, punishment, exhaustion. It all blended into a relentless cycle. My body moved through the motions, but inside I felt hollow. Even when I tried to summon faith, it slipped from me like water through cupped hands. And yet, a small ember remained. It came in brief moments, when another novice brushed my hand by accident and gave me the faintest smile, or when a bird landed on the convent wall and sang as though the world outside still existed. These small glimpses reminded me that life beyond these walls had not vanished entirely. Something inside me whispered that the truth was waiting, if only I could find the strength to search for it. One afternoon, while scrubbing the refectory floor, I overheard two older nuns speaking in hushed tones. They did not see me bent low by the benches. Their words were faint, but one sentence struck me like a bolt of lightning. "The mother keeps many secrets. If the bishop ever knew, this house would not stand." My heart froze. Secrets. I clung to that word as though it were a lifeline. What secrets? And could those secrets explain the shadow of fear that hung over us all? That night, I could not sleep. I turned the words over and over in my mind. Secrets meant there was truth hidden here, truth powerful enough to threaten the convent itself. Perhaps my suffering was not just personal weakness or divine punishment. Perhaps it was part of something much larger, something deliberately concealed. The idea both frightened and emboldened me. For the first time, I felt a flicker of determination. If there were truths buried within these walls, I needed to uncover them. I owed it not only to myself, but to the other girls who suffered in silence beside me. I rose from my bed and stared out the narrow window. The moon hung low, silver and cold, casting long shadows across the courtyard. In that moment, I made a silent vow, not to obedience, not to the convent, but to myself. I would endure, but I would also watch, listen, learn. One day, I would uncover the truth they tried so hard to bury. The chains of silence still bound me, but now, deep within my heart, another chain had begun to crack. Doubt had planted a seed of rebellion, and though small, it was alive. I remember the night as if it were carved into my very soul. The convent was wrapped in silence, its long corridors breathing with shadows. I had grown used to silence here, but this silence felt different, almost watchful, as though the walls themselves were guarding something they didn't want me to know. My doubts had already begun to take root, and yet I had clung to faith, believing that perhaps my questions were only trials from God. But that night, the silence pressed too heavily on me, and curiosity began to outweigh my fear. The other sisters had retired to their cells, and the dim oil lamps along the hallway flickered with a weary glow. I slipped out barefoot, the cold stone floor numbing my feet, each step echoing faintly as if announcing my disobedience. My heart pounded against my ribs, torn between the training drilled into me, obedience without question, and the desperate need to understand why I felt so abandoned, why God's voice had grown so faint. I had always been told that certain areas of the convent were off limits, especially the rooms behind the sacristy. They called them the archives, though none of us novices were permitted near them. Tonight, that was exactly where my feet carried me. I pressed against the heavy wooden door, half expecting it to resist, but to my shock it creaked open as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was thick with dust and candle smoke. Wooden shelves lined the walls, burdened with ledgers, letters, and records stacked so tightly they seemed to groan under their own secrets. I lit a small taper from the lamp near the altar and carried it inside, my hands trembling. At first, what I found seemed ordinary: records of supplies, donations, names of benefactors who had long since died. But then, tucked between ledgers, I found bundles of personal letters bound with faded ribbon. My fingers shook as I untied them. The ink had browned with age, but the words cut me deeply. They spoke of young women sent here not out of piety, but because their families considered them burdens or disgraces. They spoke of promises made by priests to desperate parents, that their daughters would be purified through service. My breath caught in my throat, for the words mirrored my own life. I had been forced here at 17, told it was God's will, but perhaps it was never God's will at all. The more I read, the colder I felt. There were letters of wealthy men donating money in exchange for silence about scandals. There were notations about punishments delivered not for sins, but for disobedience or questioning authority. My heart broke when I read a letter from a girl I had never known, begging her family to take her back. The letter was marked unanswered. Tears blurred my vision as I realized these were not isolated stories. They were patterns, repeated through years, perhaps centuries. Every story resembled mine, each voice crying out from the pages with pain and betrayal. I was not chosen by God to be here. I was placed here because it was convenient for others. The veil I had worn with trembling reverence suddenly felt like chains around my head. I sank to my knees, clutching the letters against my chest. How could this be? I whispered into the silence. My whole life I had been told to trust, to obey, to believe that sacrifice brought holiness. And yet, here were the hidden truths: exploitation, silence, lives stolen in the name of obedience. As I wept, I thought I heard movement in the hall. Hastily, I blew out the taper and pressed myself into the shadows. 2 voices drifted through the half-closed door, 2 senior nuns whispering in hushed tones. "She's been asking too many questions," one said. "She's young," the other replied, "but dangerous if she keeps searching. The truth could unravel everything." Their footsteps faded, but their words echoed inside me louder than any sermon. It was not just that they feared my doubts. They feared the truth itself. That confirmed everything the letters had whispered. I sat there for what felt like hours, my body shaking not only from fear, but from a strange new strength rising inside me. For the first time since entering the convent, I no longer felt guilty for my questions. I no longer believed that doubt was sin. Doubt was clarity. Doubt was light shining into darkness. When I finally slipped back to my cell, dawn was already brushing the sky with pale color. I closed the door behind me, pressing my back against the wood, my chest still heaving. My pillow grew wet with tears, but they were not only tears of sorrow. They were tears of awakening. I understood now. My silence had been their weapon, my obedience their shield. But I had broken through that silence tonight. The truth had revealed itself to me, and with it came a new kind of courage. I knew I could never see the convent the same way again. I did not yet know how I would act or when. But I knew one thing with certainty. I would not die in silence like the others. My story would not end with unanswered letters gathering dust in forgotten archives. That night marked the beginning of my rebellion. The morning after I uncovered the truth, I moved like a shadow through the convent halls. Every toll of the bells struck deeper than before, no longer a summons to prayer, but a reminder of the weight I now carried. The air itself felt heavier, as if every corridor whispered of the letters I had read, of the voices silenced long before mine. My hands folded linen and scrubbed stone floors as they always had, but my body worked without spirit. Inside me, questions roared like an unending storm. I avoided the eyes of the sisters, but even when I tried, I could feel their stares grazing me. Had they sensed the shift? Did they see the fear that clung to me like a shroud? At meals, I sat among them in silence, listening to the scrape of spoons and the hollow echo of prayers muttered by weary lips. Each word of obedience now felt poisoned, and yet I spoke them because I was afraid not to. The knowledge I held was like a flame hidden in my chest, fierce, alive, but dangerous. In the chapel, the candles flickered against faces, bowed in reverence. I stared at the crucifix above the altar and wondered if Christ himself had ever felt trapped by silence. Was I meant to endure as he endured, or was I called to act, to refuse, to resist? The uncertainty carved at me. Faith had once been my refuge, but now even prayer was tangled with doubt. The Mother Superior's gaze followed me more closely in those days. Her eyes were sharp, weighing, as though she could read the rebellion gnawing at my spirit. Once, she stopped me in the corridor, her hand pressing firmly against my shoulder. Her words were soft, but her grip was iron. "Guard your thoughts, child. Pride destroys more swiftly than sin." I lowered my head, feigning humility, but inside I trembled. She knew, or at least she suspected. That night, alone in my cell, I wept silently into the rough wool of my blanket. The tears came not only from fear, but from grief. Grief for the women whose letters I had touched, for their dreams strangled and voices buried. Their sorrow had seeped into me, and now it lived in my bones. I feared becoming one of them, a ghost pressed between pages, remembered only in secret. The days stretched on, each one marked by an invisible distance growing between me and the others. Some sisters avoided me, their footsteps quickening when I approached, as though my presence carried contagion. Others lingered too long, their eyes darting with curiosity they dared not speak aloud. I was caught between suspicion and silent recognition, and in that no man's land, loneliness deepened. The smallest details cut me the most. The way conversations hushed when I entered a room. The way prayers seemed louder when I faltered in repeating them. Even the air seemed colder around me, as though walls themselves had decided I no longer belonged. I tried to steady myself in prayer, but prayer itself had changed. No longer was it a surrender to obedience. Instead, it became my only thread of sanity. I prayed not for blind devotion, but for courage, for clarity, for the women who had gone before me. I prayed for strength to endure the aftermath of knowing the truth when silence would have been easier. The Mother Superior eventually summoned me. She said nothing of the letters, yet every word she spoke was heavy with warning. "You are troubled," she said, her voice measured. "Doubt is a seed that once planted can choke out salvation. You must root it out before it ruins you." Her words should have comforted me, but they only deepened the fracture inside me. For how could I root out doubt when the truth itself had planted it? Her watch grew tighter after that. I was assigned harsher tasks, scrubbing stone steps until my hands bled, fasting longer than the others, hours of prayer alone in the chapel until my knees ached against the cold marble floor. Each punishment was disguised as discipline, but I knew what it was. It was containment. It was control. Yet even in that exhaustion, the weight of truth did not leave me. At night, when sleep refused me, I whispered the names of the women from the letters, as though speaking them aloud kept them alive. They had been silenced, but in my solitude I tried to give them voice again. Their suffering became the rhythm of my heart, their memory the fuel of my defiance. Still I was afraid. My body trembled when I imagined what might come if I dared to speak aloud what I knew. Would they cast me out, confine me, break me until I bent to obedience again? The uncertainty gnawed at me, and I felt myself unraveling between fear and longing, longing for freedom, longing for justice, longing simply to be heard. One evening, after a long day of forced silence, I caught the faintest glance from a younger sister. Her eyes lingered on mine for just a breath longer than propriety allowed, and in that fleeting look, I saw something I had not seen in days. Recognition. Perhaps she too had glimpsed the truth, or at least sensed it within me. That brief spark warmed the ashes of my spirit. Even in this aftermath, perhaps I was not entirely alone, but I knew better than to trust it openly. The aftermath was not a time for boldness. It was a time for survival. So I bent my head, carried my burdens, and endured the weight of suspicion pressing in on every side. Yet beneath it all, something within me refused to die. The truth was a seed now rooted in me, and though buried deep in fear, I could feel it waiting for its moment to grow. When I think back to those days after confinement, I realize that healing did not begin with freedom. It began with choice. The choice to keep breathing, to keep hoping, to believe that my story did not end with silence. Alone in that small cell, I made a vow to myself. If I could not walk out yet, I would at least not surrender my spirit. That decision became the first fragile step of my healing. At first, it was nothing more than whispers of prayer, not the rehearsed verses they demanded, but words my heart formed on its own. I prayed for the women whose letters I had read, their pain etched into every line. I prayed for the younger sisters still bound by fear. I prayed even for myself, though my prayers were not for deliverance, but for courage. Each whispered word felt like stitching a torn fabric, mending something that had been ripped apart inside me. Days blurred, but within that blur came moments of clarity. I remembered the girl I once was, the one who had laughed freely before the convent walls enclosed me. I remembered the sound of wind through the fields outside my family's home, the warmth of my mother's hand, the dreams I had carried before they were crushed. Those memories, long buried, became sparks of life. They reminded me that I was not born only for obedience, nor created merely to suffer. I had once been whole, and I could be again. One evening, after endless hours of solitude, I pressed my forehead against the cold wooden door of my cell. Through its cracks, I could hear faint footsteps and murmured prayers from the hall. Suddenly, I realized I was not entirely alone. Others breathed beyond those walls, others whose hearts perhaps carried the same unspoken wounds. That thought gave me strength. Healing, I understood, was not only for myself but for them as well. If I could hold on, perhaps I could help them one day hold on too. When I was eventually allowed back among the sisters, I carried myself differently. My body was thin, my eyes hollow from sleepless nights, but there was a steadiness in me I had never felt before. The Mother Superior still watched me with suspicion, but her threats no longer pierced the way they once had. For I knew a truth she could not take from me. They could discipline my body, but not my spirit. The path of healing was not sudden. It came in small mercies. A young sister slipping me a piece of bread during fasting. An older nun pressing her hand briefly to mine, her eyes filled with sorrow and understanding. A shared glance during prayer that carried more compassion than any spoken word. These moments reminded me that within the rigid stone walls of the convent, there still lived a quiet humanity, fragile but real. My healing deepened the day I dared to write. With scraps of parchment stolen from the scriptorium, I began to put my own story into words. At first, my hand shook so much that the ink bled across the page, but slowly the lines took shape. I wrote of my childhood, of the day I was forced into the convent, of the grief that swallowed me whole. I wrote of the letters I had found, the voices that had guided me in the dark. I wrote because I feared being silenced forever, and if my voice could not be spoken, it would at least be etched into ink. Those pages became my mirror, and with each word, I reclaimed a part of myself. Healing, I discovered, was not the absence of pain. The ache of betrayal and confinement lingered, and some days it was almost unbearable. But healing meant that pain no longer ruled me. It meant that I could breathe alongside it, that I could carry it without being crushed. It meant that even with scars, I could still move forward. Slowly, the world within the convent began to look different to me. The rigid routines no longer felt like chains, but like patterns I could observe with distance. I learned to find beauty in small things, a shaft of light through stained glass, the warmth of bread when it was fresh from the oven, the music of hymns when sung softly, without command. These fleeting moments did not erase the cruelty I had endured, but they reminded me that life held more than sorrow. One night, as I sat in the chapel long after prayers had ended, I felt something I had not felt in years: peace. It was not the peace they had promised me through obedience, nor the peace of blind submission. It was the peace of knowing that I had survived. I had walked through darkness and had not been extinguished. That peace settled over me like a cloak, thin but real, and I wept softly in gratitude. The path of healing was not only inward, it was also in the courage to quietly reach out. I began to speak gently to younger sisters, to ask them about their dreams, their fears, their lives before the convent. Sometimes they answered only with silence, but other times their eyes filled with tears, and I knew they carried wounds too. In those moments, I shared pieces of my own story. Not all, not enough to endanger them or myself, but enough to let them know they were not alone. Those small exchanges were seeds, fragile yet powerful, planted in the soil of silence. In time, I realized healing was not an end, but a path I would walk for the rest of my life. The convent walls still stood around me. The Mother Superior still held her authority, but within me, something had shifted permanently. The truth had taken root, and with it, hope. As I lay in my narrow bed at night, listening to the distant toll of the bells, I no longer heard chains. I heard resilience. I heard the rhythm of survival, the beating of my own heart refusing to be silenced. The aftermath had left me broken, but the path of healing was stitching me back together, piece by fragile piece. And though I did not yet know where this path would lead, I knew one thing with certainty: I would never again allow silence to be my master. When I look back now, I see not only the darkness I endured, but also the light that somehow refused to be extinguished. My story, once buried within convent walls, is no longer only mine. It belongs to every woman who ever whispered prayers no one heard, who carried wounds no one tended, who was silenced by fear, yet longed for freedom. Their voices live through mine, and in telling my truth, I carry theirs into the world. For many years, I thought of my life as wasted. I mourned the girl who was taken at 17, the dreams that withered before they could bloom. I thought of the family I lost, the choices I never made, the youth I could never reclaim. But slowly, as time softened the sharpest edges of grief, I began to understand that even in suffering, life carves meaning. The chains meant to destroy me became the very proof of my resilience. The silence forced upon me became the space where I discovered my true voice. I began to write more openly, not only for myself, but for those who might one day read my words. Pages filled with memories of sorrow also carried glimpses of hope. Hope that no story, no matter how broken, is ever fully lost. I imagined a young girl, perhaps years from now, finding these words and realizing she was not alone. If my story could ease even one heart, then my life, however scarred, would not be in vain. There were days when bitterness threatened to consume me. I would think of the Mother Superior's cold eyes, of the way she wielded obedience like a weapon. I would think of the sisters who turned away, too afraid to help. But I also thought of the small acts of kindness, the bread slipped into my hands, the gentle prayers whispered outside my cell, the young sister who told me I was not alone. Those fragments of compassion taught me that even in places built to suppress love, it still found ways to bloom, and it was those small kindnesses that reminded me to carry compassion forward. Healing gave me the courage to forgive, though not in the way they preached. I did not excuse the cruelty or pretend the scars were not real. My forgiveness was not for them, it was for me. I released the weight of hatred so it would not poison the rest of my days. I learned that freedom begins not only with unlocked doors, but also with unburdened hearts. As years passed, I became a quiet listener within the convent. Younger sisters sought me in whispers, unburdening their fears, their doubts, their longings for the world beyond. I could not change their circumstances, but I could give them what I once longed for: understanding, encouragement, a reminder that their worth was not defined by obedience alone. In their eyes, I saw reflections of myself, and each time I offered them comfort, I healed a little more of my own soul. I do not claim to have conquered my pain entirely. Some nights, I still wake with the echo of bells that once marked punishment, not prayer. Some mornings, I feel the weight of all the years that slipped away, never to return. Yet I have learned that life is not measured only by what was lost, but also by what endures. And what endured in me was not silence, but truth. Not despair, but hope. My legacy, if I dare call it that, is not grand. I was not a saint, nor a leader, nor a figure of history. I was simply a woman who suffered, who stumbled, who spoke when speaking was forbidden, and who found her way back to her own soul. But perhaps that is legacy enough. For every time my story is remembered, it strikes against the silence that once imprisoned me, and so I leave behind not bitterness, but a plea. To anyone who hears these words, never underestimate the strength of your voice. Even whispered truths can outlive walls built to contain them. Even the smallest act of courage can awaken hope in others. What was nearly lost in me has become a flame that, though fragile, still burns. As I close this chapter of my life, I do so with both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for what was taken, but gratitude for what survived. My youth may have been stolen, but my spirit endured. My silence may have been forced, but my voice has returned. And though scars remain, they are no longer marks of defeat, but symbols of survival. This is the end of my story, yet not the end of its meaning. For even as the convent walls fade into memory, the truth they tried to bury rises still. And as long as I breathe, I will carry that truth forward, not only for myself, but for all who were silenced, for all who still wait to be heard. Because in the end, legacy is not built from obedience, it is built from courage. And though I was forced into the convent at 17, though I walked through shadows no one should endure, I stand now with a truth no one can erase. I survived, and in surviving, I became free.